ISIS is dealt with and the territory is taken, the Syrian army is going to have to deal with them as well after they finish with ISIS.
To Afghanistan now, where a Taliban suicide bomber has detonated a device outside America's largest military facility in the country. No soldiers were killed in the blast at the Bagram air base. Samira Khan reports.
Well, a suicide bomber has detonated explosives at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. The attack is believed to be a response to a highly offensive leaflet distributed by U.S. forces in the Parwan province on Tuesday that depicted part of the Taliban flag along with a passage from the Quran on a dog. This is an animal that's considered unclean in Islam. The bombing occurred only hours after a senior U.S. commander in Afghanistan apologized for the leaflet. The Taliban responded, saying it showed America's hatred for Islam and that it proves the war in the country is a war between Islam and unbelief, according to news reports. But this isn't the first time controversy struck the area. In February 2012, U.S. soldiers mistakenly burned Qurans at the same Bagram base, alongside damaged books and texts from the airfield's library. Well, the incident prompted widespread protests and resulted in several deaths. But we have to think that while fundamentalism is mostly to blame for this incident, it seems like U.S. imperialism plays a strong role in providing these terrorists with a motive to perpetrate these attacks. One can only wonder if Trump's new policy on Afghanistan will further exacerbate the situation.
Still to come, a Russian Bitcoin trader is wanted by the U.S. over alleged money laundering. We have that story coming up after the break. Stay with us.
Elon Musk over there at Tesla, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, they're all arguing about artificial intelligence. Like, is it going to destroy the world? Elon Musk says maybe it will. Mark Zuckerberg is already destroying the world, so why does he care? Let's find out more.
Welcome back. Now, the US is pushing for the extradition of a Russian national accused of cybercrimes and money laundering. Alexander Vinnik was arrested in Greece back in July at the request of the US Justice Department. He's accused of using the cryptocurrency trading website Bitcoin to launder more than $4 billion. Greek authorities are currently considering the extradition request. Mr. Vinnik spoke to us by phone through his lawyer from prison in his first interview since his arrest.
I do not. I worked for the company and carried out my duties, and it's not right to blame me for that. I only found out what the accusations were a month after I was arrested. My Russian lawyer told me about them. I would say they are mistaken. I don't have any planes, yachts, or any other luxury possessions. First, because I haven't done anything illegal. Second, I don't understand what the US has to do with me, and why they should be judging a Russian citizen.
The Russian Foreign Ministry has said it's closely monitoring the situation to ensure that the suspect's rights are being respected. Mr. Vinnik's wife, Alexandra, also spoke to RT, giving further details about her husband's detention.
I turned around and saw that my husband was surrounded by around 20 men. 20 men wearing t-shirts and sunglasses took part in his arrest. He was handcuffed. Our children were there at the time. These men walked him away. They also took mobile phones and the key to our hotel room from my bag. As far as I know, they searched the room. Me and my children were kept on the beach from 11 in the morning until 7 p.m. under the supervision of 3 men. We couldn't leave. The children didn't get anything to eat at all. As far as I know from the documents sent from the US, the BTC's activities were against the law there. The document says the managers knew they were creating a platform for money laundering because it wasn't registered, it didn't have a license, and because such business models allow criminals to use the exchange. All the charges are being made based on this statement. By this way of thinking, you could make the manufacturers of frying pans, for example, guilty because wives hid their husbands with them. It's the same thing. Obviously, his return to Russia is my main goal. My husband agrees to be extradited only to Russia and no other country. He wants to come home to his family, to his children.
Now, a Brazilian man has been fooling the media for 3 years, pretending to be a United Nations war photographer. Auntie's Miguel Francis Santiago has the story.
The author of these pictures boasts an enviable list of clients, including major news outlets like the BBC, Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, and Deutsche Welle. But wait a minute. Those are just inverted images by another war zone photographer. Anyone who knows how to use Google reverse image search could have sorted this out. But unfortunately, no one bothered to check. And that's exactly how, for 3 years, Eduardo Martins managed to pull off pretending to be a UN photographer who traveled to Syria, Iraq, Gaza, and many other hotspots. The man who actually took these photos was quite shocked.
The worst thing about it was the way he changed my captions and kind of like reframed the stories of the people I photographed a few years before, to like make his, he repackaged my content to make his more current and sellable. I feel like he wasn't really vetted because he had a strong social media following. There was like 127,000 people on his Twitter. And I think that made a lot of the editors at the photo agencies that moved his stuff a little lazy. Yeah, I'm really disappointed. It sucks. I do believe that this guy, whoever he is, did a lot to foster distrust between the public and the news media at large.
To make his deception more believable, Eduardo Martins, if that's his real name, which most likely isn't, posted selfies from Somalia and Aleppo. Well, you don't need to be an expert to see that this has hints of Photoshop. But hey, the posts had all the right tags of Aleppo in ruins and so on, so who cares? No one bothered to take a closer look. Even the man in these photos was actually a British surfer who was alerted by his news-savvy friends that his identity was stolen.
I was relaxing, having some wine, when a friend from Wavelength magazine contacted me, saying that someone has stolen my identity in a kind of a prank on the internet.
So it seems we're dealing with an internet troll who conned some of the biggest names in the world of news into buying his photos. Perhaps those compelling interviews had a trusting effect.
Once in Iraq shooting a conflict, I stopped shooting to help a boy who was hit by Molotov, dropped the camera and helped him get out of the conflict area. In scenes like this, I stopped being a photographer and become a human being.
He was also feeding the media a pitiful story of his childhood, which included a battle with leukemia and being abused while growing up, both of which he managed to overcome and use as inspiration for war photography. He also claimed he was working for an NGO, Children's Safe Drinking Water, which must have been easy to fact-check, but no one did. But now the cat's out of the bag. The BBC confirms that this was indeed a con man whose photos, unfortunately, they've used while promising to better their verification process. The fraudster, whose identity is still unknown, has deleted the photos and accounts associated with them, leaving only an unpleasant remnant for the major media system he managed to trick into showing something that was entirely fake. Miguel Francis Santiago, RT.
Share your thoughts on the day's stories by following us on Facebook and Twitter. And join me at the top of the hour for the latest headlines.
Jambo la kwanza, tukianzisha mafunzo, tuna jambo ambalo tunaita the definition, sio? Ambaye ni kujikinga ni nini? Sawa?
Sasa ile mimi nikusirika sababu kila saa ikimkuta tukikutana na yeye ananiambia twende kwa yeye. Haiwezekani. No. No.
Ya ngumi kugonga wapi? Hapa kwa shingo. Ama tunaweza tumia kugonga wapi? Pia hapa. Sawa sawa.
No! Nasikia hasira imekuwa mingi. Alafu sasa inabidi badala ani face na mtokea upande nimgonge hapa. Kigonga.
Because the rape incidents in Korokocho were very high for the grannies.
The United Nations and the Security Council in particular should not be a place for futile rhetorics and a spotlight to master their rhetoric skills. They should be a place. It should be a place which should perform its main responsibility to maintain the international peace and security.
Welcome to Worlds Apart. The North Korean situation has long favored the status quo as the lesser evil. The prospect of war seemed much worse than anything Pyongyang was capable of. But over the past year, two things changed. North Korea got new technology and the United States got a new president. With all the bluster about the nuclear blast, is the status quo still sustainable for everybody involved? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Donald Manzula, a former U.S. congressman and current president of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Mr. Manzula, it's great to talk to you. Thank you for your time.
It's nice to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, the Korean problem has long had a tendency of heating up every 2 to 3 years, but this time around, the North Koreans indeed have a far more sophisticated technology to back up their threats, and the United States seems to have a much shorter fuse. Which of these two factors do you find more troubling?
Well, I don't think the question's fair. First of all, the fuse is not with the United States. The fuse is with North Korea. North Korea has continued to violate numerous UN admonishments as to not continuing with this nuclear capability. They've broken several agreements with the United States. They have continued to test now their sixth test for a nuclear bomb, and apparently they've developed the hydrogen bomb, and apparently they have the ICBM. And so it's not a question. Jet exposes the growth of the nuclear weapon system in North Korea was saying that the United States has a short fuse. I'm not sure I understand where you're going.
Mr. Manzula, it's not really surprising for anyone to see that North Korea continues to violate international law. There is no disagreement on that, I think, internationally, but I think we have never had an American president who would express his displeasure with that in such an abrasive way and put the military option so squarely on the table. Doesn't that make you a little bit worried?
I'm always worried whenever somebody is about to become a new nuclear power. But there's been no U.S. president who has ever been in the position of having an ICBM lobbed across the mainland of Japan, and then been threatened in the most horrible way with saying, with Kim Jong-un saying that the U.S. really is the enemy of North Korea, and then North Korea is going to destroy it. And if you want to talk about bellicose words, first you have to start with Kim Jong-un. And in fact, when President Trump used the language that he did and the language is quite clear, it's fire and fury. There were 3 prominent Americans who found nothing wrong with that language. Former Senator Lieberman, he said, he said the language was not aimed at North Korea, it was aimed at China. Nicholas Burns, who would have been the Secretary of State under President Clinton, said Sure, his words were not Churchillian. They were not the greatest in diplomatic languages, but they were aimed at China. And then Gordon Chang also. I mean, if I were president, I wouldn't have used those words, but I wouldn't dwell on. I would dwell more on what North Korea is doing than on two words that were said spontaneously by the President of the United States.
Mr. Manzullo, you quoted Mr. Burns, and Mr. Burns was also extremely critical of Donald Trump for essentially trying to blame South Korea for what Mr. Trump called in his tweet the talk of appeasement with the North, also adding that they, meaning the North, only understand one thing. What could that one thing be in your view?
That's not what I'm talking about. The reference that I had, Oksana, was that in the words on Fire and Fury, those words were aimed at China to get China involved in this thing. Now, I'm not going to dwell on words that one particular president doesn't use or does use. I came here to talk about North Korea and the threat that it has to the world.
But Mr. Manzullo, my point was that Mr. Trump employs very unconventional language, not only with regards to North Korea, but also concerning the United States' closest ally, South Korea, which interests, I'm sure, are very close to your heart. Don't you find that kind of language rather questionable?
He's the President of the United States. If I were president, I would use different language.
Mr. Manzullo, to draw you back to the question I posed before, the tweet by President Trump, he said that they, meaning the North Koreans, only understand one thing. What do you think he could mean by that one thing?
No, he said that everything is on the table, so you can't rule out anything.
Well, when you say everything is on the table, you do not narrow it down to one thing.
Oksana, don't ask me to get inside the mind of Donald Trump because I'm not capable of doing that.
You wrote an article just last month in the National Interest laying out the possible consequences of a preventative military strike by the United States. I think you find this possibility quite worrying. You also referred time and time again to the U.S. allies who, in your view, have to be consulted on this. But judging again from the language of Mr. Trump, he's not very courteous towards South Korea. How is that kind of language taken in Seoul?
I didn't come here to talk about the President Trump's language, and I don't want to argue with you, but the world is in a very difficult situation. Let me talk about my article, okay, and talk about North Korea. The reason why I would oppose a so-called they call them preventive strikes, or call them what you want, unless you know a missile with a warhead is on its way. You don't go ahead and launch countermeasures. And the problem with some type of a preventive strike is the fact that, and most people forget the fact that North Korea presently has in place artillery that's aimed at South Korea, that has hundreds of thousands of rounds, that has been there for years. And they could just use unconventional warfare and kill tens of thousands of people in the northern part of South Korea. And then to try to go in there and do some type of a preventive strike to take out a capability, something on that nature, it just would not work. And so the time that military option could be used is if, in fact, we know for sure, 100% verifiable, with the rockets warming up, that there's ready to be a launch, or that a launch is in progress with a nuclear warhead that could hit any part of the world, or rather that could hit any of our allies, including the United States.
Well, Mr. Manzullo, intelligence is not always reliable in this day and age, and I think we learned it hard way through the course of several conflicts. But since you mentioned something about South Korea, it seems that the language that is coming out of Seoul has also been changing, and South Korean National Security Advisor recently said that South Korea would not be against using most powerful strategic assets in order to quote-unquote neutralize DPRK's nuclear facilities. So it seems that even Seoul now is talking about a preventative strike. Doesn't that make you concerned?
No, I disagree. They're not talking about a preventative strike. Seoul knows more than anybody the fact that any type of preventative strike would bring about immediate retaliation, not even including a missile, but with regard to the fixed artillery that have been in place for years. Song Yun-moon, who is the defense minister, and I look at the quotes here saying the possibility of referring to tactical nuclear weapons, but he said he really did not mean to talk about that in terms of the actual deployment of the tactical nuclear weapons that were removed in 1991. And then Foreign Minister Kang said, well, we definitely have no plans to bring back tactical nuclear weapons because the whole goal is to have a Korean peninsula that is free of nuclear weapons. And if South Korea brings back the tactical nuclear weapons, then they've lost the moral high ground in terms of any possible agreement or negotiations with North Korea.
Mr. Manzul, there are still the South Korean officials are still talking about neutralizing DPRK's nuclear facilities, and something tells me that that may be interpreted as extremely provocative in Pyongyang. In fact, I've heard a number of Russian diplomats say over the last week or so that in Asian countries in particular, public pressure, especially in the forms of ultimatums, is almost always counterproductive simply because it leaves the other side with no recourse but to escalate. Don't you think that Kim Jong-un's space for maneuver is now extremely limited, far more limited than that of Washington and Seoul? Don't you think that that kind of language could be provocative?
If that's the case, then Russia should not be objecting to the installation of the rest of the THAAD anti-missile projectiles. If you're talking about a provocation, if you're talking about defense, then you're going to have to wonder why Russia and China are both opposed to South Korea defending itself with purely defensive projectiles called THAAD.
Well, I think you know the answer to that question because you know that both China and Russia have their own strategic and security interests in the region. None of them wants to see North Korea as a nuclear power, but they don't want to see American and South Korean military exercises in the region. I'm sure you are well aware of that as well.
Well, I'm aware of the fact also, but President Putin also said the only thing that is left is, here's the words that he just said. Let me quote to you what President Putin said. And to a certain degree, I approve of what he said. He said the escalating North Korean crisis could cause a, quote, planetary catastrophe and huge loss of life. Ramping up military hysteria in such conditions is senseless. It is a dead end, he told reporters in China. It could lead to global planetary catastrophe and a huge loss of human life. There is no other way to solve the North Korean nuclear issue save that of peaceful dialogue. Well, that's fine, but where's the peaceful dialogue?
Mr. Manzul, I don't think you quoted Mr. Putin to the fullest extent of his remarks, because he also said that it would be foolish to expect from the North Koreans to abandon what is essentially their only security guarantee, which is this nascent nuclear program. Nobody is approving of it, but it is also, if you consider that from a realpolitik point of view, and if you take into account recent American invasions of various countries, wouldn't that be logical that North Korea would be on path and adamant in developing its nuclear program as the only protection against possible American strike?
You have to listen very carefully to what you just said. America has no desire to occupy North Korea, to go in there and to take out the president of North Korea.
But Mr. Manzula, America had no desire to take over Libya, and yet it did, and it threw the country into chaos. It had no desire to occupy Iraq or Afghanistan, and yet it did. So, why should North Korea be an exception?
Oksana, I came here to talk about North Korea, not about other countries in which Russia is involved or the United States is involved. The issue here is that President Putin has called for a peaceful dialogue to resolve the issue in North Korea. Everybody agrees with that. No peaceful dialogue is taking place. So what do? I mean, that's what's going on. Do you just sit by and continue to see Kim Jong-un develop his nuclear capabilities, which could really endanger both China and Russia in the event that there's a mistake take place or there's an accident involving a country developing nuclear weapons that has no history of how to handle nuclear weapons? Or do you get involved in sanctions, or what do you do? And so everybody's trying to come up with a way, hopefully, that would bring Kim Jong-un to his knees and say, look, I'm in a position now where the whole world is against what I'm doing, such as what the nations did in ending apartheid in South Africa.
Well, Mr. Manzullo, we have to take a short break now, but we will be back in just a few moments. Stay tuned.
Me agarraron de mis brazos, así la otra y la otra aquí. ¿O quieres parir como gato? ¿Quieres parir como pollo, como la rata? Desde hoy día vas a decir gracias al señor Fujimori porque para que ya no tengas tu hijo.
Ahora se ha tejido una leyenda negra en torno a esto solo por perseguir al presidente Fujimori y al Fujimorismo. Escasísimo los números de personas que han podido una obligación.
Le pide del Papa Dios, te lleva a mi nomás ya. Con dolor de cuerpo, con dolor de barriguita.
En los misiones se ve clarito, niños sentados ahí o parados, llorando. Sus almas quieren salir.
Estos son los oficios del Ministerio de Salud, donde se menciona las campañas de esterilizaciones forzadas. Fueron 314.605 personas esterilizadas.
The war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day.
While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
The hawks. The hawks. These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will watch.
Worlds Apart with Donald Manzullo, president of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Mr. Manzullo, North Korea has been under a very strict sanction regime for quite some time already. That clearly didn't change their behavior. What makes you believe that yet another round of sanctions is going to change anything?
Well, they're not strict sanctions. That's the problem. Is that you have to do a couple of things, and both Russia and China could really help out. Russia sends refined petroleum to North Korea, and China sends unrefined petroleum to the only refinery that North Korea has. You choke off the energy, and then you work with China. Say, look, you've got to stop using your banks as a method of cleansing the money that's going back to North Korea through their trade that gives them the hard currency, that gives them the ability to buy all these different parts of the weaponry that they presently have. I mean, it's a plan. Yeah, but it will take every nation in the world, especially China and Russia, to agree upon a plan to stop, in the words of President Putin, a planetary catastrophe.
Well, Mr. Manzullo, again, Russia and China are extremely concerned about the problem, but they are not there to do the American bidding, with all due respect. Speaking about...
This is not American bidding. This is the world bidding, trying to stop another nuclear power It's not the United States alone. And neither China nor Russia have been threatened with annihilation by a country developing a nuclear weapon. China and Russia should be very much concerned.
Well, China and Russia are absolutely concerned. Mr. Mandula, I don't want to reiterate the same point over and over again. I think what I find questionable is this habit on the part of the United States, which has been aggravated under this administration, to issue commands to the rest of the world. You cannot encourage those negotiations that you so want to see just by tweeting out. If the United States wants to lead the world in this effort, organize talks, bring everybody to the table.
You talked about the same tweet for 6 times. I'm here to talk about the big picture of what we're going to do. I don't know the mind of Donald Trump. I don't know why he tweets. If I was an advisor, I would advise him to give up his Twitter account. I just don't think that's good diplomacy. I think you have a situation where you have a new president in South Korea who's doing his best to bring about his country, to get everybody on the same page in that country, to present to them the actual threat that's going on, who's leading his country to get the rest of THAAD installed, and to do everything he can with both defensive weapons and with the open door of negotiations to bring about a peaceful resolution. Obviously, that's something that Russia should be in favor of.
Russia has absolutely no disagreements with South Korea. This is actually what Mr. Putin said a couple of months ago.
Well, he does. Russia does have a problem with South Korea because South Korea wants to defend itself with the THAAD system.
Well, that system is also supplied by by another country with which Russia has problems with. So I'm not sure whether the root cause here is the South Korean relationship or the American one.
What difference does it make where it comes from? If Korea developed its own THAAD system, Russia would still be opposed to it.
Well, because Russia fears that could strengthen the American influence in the region. If the United States wants to discuss that constructively, I'm sure both Russia and China would be on board with that.
I really, Oksana, I totally disagree with your premise. This isn't about strengthening American influence. This is about keeping a nuclear war from breaking out that would hurt everybody, including Russia. Everybody has the same goal. And that is world peace. The difference is that both China and Russia apparently are willing to stand by and see North Korea develop a nuclear weapon and then try to contain it, whereas the rest of the world and obviously South Korea doesn't really think that's the best strategy.
Well, Mr. Mandula, I think from this vantage point, the problem with ensuring global peace is, senseless invasions of countries time and time again. I think that is also part of the equation with North Korea. But rather than arguing about the same things, you mentioned that I referred to the same tweet 5 or 6 times. I want to bring in another tweet by Mr. Trump in which he said that he was considering the suspension of trade with the countries that do business with North Korea, which puts China at the forefront as both Pyongyang's and Washington's largest trade partner. Do you think the United States can realistically afford to penalize China in such a way without first hurting itself? And also, more generally, aren't you concerned that this war of words between Beijing and Washington is also going to draw, between Pyongyang and Washington, is also going to draw in Beijing in not so constructive manner?
Well, first of all, nobody wants to see a trade war. If the only way to stop a thermonuclear war is to get involved in a secondary boycott, which would be not doing business with any nation that's doing business with North Korea, that could be an option that's on the table. It's not the preferred one, but I think the reason President Trump mentioned that is the fact that the whole world is so concerned with North Korea becoming a new nuclear power that it's willing to use any peaceful method in order to bring that, in order to see that doesn't happen. And one of those unfortunate tactics would be involved in a big trade dispute or in what's called a secondary boycott. No one wants to see that, but at times that may be the only option that's on the table. We don't know. But he brought that up as simply being an option on the table.
Well, but Mr. Trump's words are perceived sometimes with distress in various capitals around the world, and I'm sure actually if South Korea still considers itself the closest American ally, I'm pretty sure many South Korean officials are also quite concerned. I wanted to ask you about Mr. Trump's another idea, and this time about walking out of a free trade agreement with Seoul. He said that this may happen as early as this weekend. I'm sure you would actually disagree with the rationale of such a move, but why do you think such an urgency?
Oksana, it took 20 minutes for us to get to an area of agreement, but that's okay. It's a very tense world, and I appreciate your passion. It would be a mistake for U.S. to pull out of Chorus FTA for several reasons. First of all, National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense, McMaster and Mattis, both said that this is not the time, with everything so tense about North Korea, etc. This is not the time to open up another area to distract from the area of security and to bring in this whole area of opening up Chorus. Second of all, the United States is really a beneficiary of Chorus, because as to those items that are on the Chorus schedule, the United States actually has an increase in exports. It's a trade agreement that really personifies what President what President Trump is talking about. So I agree with you. It'd be a very bad idea to withdraw from Chorus.
Okay, let me switch gears a little bit here, because I think what we are actually talking about is not so much, again, the threat posed by North Korea. I think everybody agrees on that, but really
No, I don't think Russia agrees on the threat. I would disagree with you.
You are not the spokesman for Donald Trump, but you're a spokesman for Russia, so you would know where Russia stands on South Korea, on that issue.
You know, I came here to talk about North Korea and not about Donald Trump, but let me just say that President Putin, he just says that he said sanctions won't work, they're useless. Well, that's interesting. That takes a peaceful tool off the table. And he says they're useless, it doesn't do any good. And he's trying to, that's a peaceful method of trying to solve something. And so if you take that off the table, then he says, well, all there is a peaceful dialogue. But if North Korea is unwilling to come to the table and get involved in a dialogue, but all we have now, and this appears to be a hopeful on the scene, is that apparently President Putin is going to be having a conversation or meeting with Presidents Abe and Moon very shortly, and I have hope that perhaps something that President Putin says to the two of them, and maybe the three countries can talk about the appropriate dialogue, the appropriate things to do. So maybe President Putin can play a role here in bringing about a peaceful dialogue in the peninsula.
Well, I'm sure he will try to do the best of his ability, but I think one other option that still remains on the table is essentially recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power and proceeding from that. Pyongyang has sought this status for quite some time. Why not give it to it?
Yeah, that's what they want, Oksana. The people say, well, what does North Korea want? What North Korea wants is to be recognized as a valid nuclear power, and then if that comes to pass, then say, well, if that's the case, then send in the inspectors. Sign at that point under the non-proliferation agreement, live by the rules that the other nuclear powers do. But I mean, that's something down the line. But at this point, I don't think anybody is ready to cede the fact that North Korea is indeed a nuclear power on the order of Russia, China, or the United States.
Well, Mr. Manzula, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I really appreciate your time and also your passion on this issue.
Thank you, Oksana. Well, I appreciate your passion, too. You did a good job.
And I also encourage our viewers to share their comments on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.
United Nations and the Security Council in particular should not be a place for futile rhetorics and a spotlight to master their rhetoric skills. They should be a place. It should be a place which should perform its main responsibility to maintain the international peace and security.
About your sudden passing, I've only just learned. You wore yourself thin, taking your last wrong turn. Your act caught up to you as we all knew it would. I'd tell you I'm sorry, if only I could. So I write these last words in hopes to put to rest these things that I never got off my chest. I remember when we first met, my life turned on each breath. But then my feelings started to change. You talked about war like it was a game. Still, some were fond of you, those that didn't like to question or argue. And I secretly promised to never be like you. It's said one does not leave a funeral the same as one enters. The mind gets consumed with death. This one quite differs. I speak to you now because there were no other takers. To proclaim that mainstream media has met its maker.
Barcelona, Dubrovnik and Venice are all perfect travel destinations. So it must be nice to live there. Or is it?
Laguna! You are destroying Venice! And you are not welcome!
Crowds of tourists disrupt the city's economic and social life.
Jer nemamo toliko povezano sa našim gradom, niti osjećaj da taj grad uopće više postoji za nas.
Que els veïns se'n van. La ciutat es buida, es banalitza, es converteix en un parc temàtic.
While the cities try desperately not to collapse, all-powerful corporations collect the profit.
A više Dubrovnikom zapravo upravljaju globalni tokovi kapitala i ekonomije, nego što zapravo on sam zna kako se pozicionirati.
You are destroying our lagoon and our city! You are a stupid way of tourism!
Is it tourist phobia or fear for hometown identity?
You know, Elon Musk over there at Tesla, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, they're all arguing about artificial intelligence. Like, is it going to destroy the world? Elon Musk says maybe it will. Mark Zuckerberg is already destroying the world, so why does he care? Let's find out more.
18 years ago, I traveled across the United States, exploring America's deadly love affair with the gun.
If a bad guy tried to get to one of my family members, he would have better luck with a butter knife against a grizzly bear than hurting one of my babies.
Since my book was published in the year 2000, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by firearms in the USA.
We had a SWAT team, yes we did. Yes, this was in middle school. We go through drills and we put ourselves in real scenarios. It was interesting to see who actually got hit by the paintball gun.
I decided to return to the subject, to track down each gun owner who I'd met and photographed those years ago.
I don't know the answer, but we are not the problem.
Korea says American pressure is getting in the way of peace in the Asian Peninsula as key parties to the conflict gather at a forum in Russia. Protesters in South Korea clash with thousands of police officers overseeing the deployment of a US missile defense system to counter the nuclear threat of Pyongyang. And Angela Merkel receives a hostile reception on her election campaign trail as demonstrators in Germany jeer and throw tomatoes during her latest rallies. And RT speaks to a Russian Bitcoin trader detained in a Greek prison and wanted by the US over money laundering charges. Hello there, this is RT International, broadcasting to you live from the Russian capital. I'm Nikki Aaron. Now, in a rare interview to an international media, a senior North Korean official has said that America's pressure on Pyongyang goes against the idea of peace in the peninsula.
The US neglects the international community's will to establish peace on the Korean peninsula. Pyongyang will retaliate against attempts to impose sanctions and pressure from Washington with powerful countermeasures.
Now, that was the head of the North Korean delegation at the Eastern Economic Forum that's currently taking place in Russia's Far East. RT's Daniel Hawkins is there for us and joins us live now. Daniel, thanks for joining us. Now, this is an economic forum, but it looks like it's been a lot more than that this year. So what have we heard today?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. It certainly has. And the North Korean delegation arriving and giving a speech just in the centre of the hall to my left was very much something people were waiting for. There was a big media scramble to hear what they had to say. Quite predictably, taking a strong, uncompromising position, saying the development of the nuclear program was something that was not up for discussion. In the meantime, in the hall just next door, the leaders of Russia, South Korea, Japan, and Mongolia were discussing also what to do about this crisis the world has been watching for some time. And although there are differences in how to resolve the crisis, they also do have, it seems, some things in common. Take a listen.
The final goal of these measures and steps is a peaceful diplomatic resolution to the crisis, and I'd like to emphasize that. There will be no war on the Korean peninsula, I am certain of that.
I, just like my South Korean colleague, am sure that a large-scale conflict, especially one with weapons of mass destruction, will not happen. All of the opposing sides have the same sense of understanding, of commitment to their people who live in the region, and we will solve this problem by diplomatic means.
All sides involved in the talks here today are directly affected. Japan, South Korea, Russia, they all share land or maritime borders with North Korea, and as we heard there, would really suffer in the event of a military escalation of this crisis. So they do share those calls to dialogue, to negotiation, just perhaps have slightly ways of getting there. Japan and Korea agree that sanctions are needed, a harshening of sanctions by the UN, targeting in particular the North Korean oil industry, but they also say that these need to be done in conjunction with discussions with Russia as well. Take a listen.
I refer to the need for tighter sanctions and believe that China and Russia are sticking to the same position, but what concrete measures need to be taken is something we must discuss together.
Now, this is in stark contrast to the position of the United States. That's been very one-sided these last few days and weeks. We can all remember Nikki Haley, Donald Trump saying that time is running out, patience is running out, and of course Trump's now infamous fire and fury comments, all really serving to ramp up the rhetoric and increase economic and military pressure on North Korea to isolate the country even more, something that is an approach that perhaps isn't so favoured here in Vladivostok. So, of course, we're now waiting on a press conference with Putin and Prime Minister Abe of Japan. We'll have more on that for you when that comes to a close.
Okay, thanks for that, Daniel. We appreciate that. That's RT's Daniel Hawkins for us. Now, Vladimir Putin faced plenty of questions on the sidelines of the forum. However, the Russian president found some of them rather perplexing.
How would you see the oncoming of the new administration in Washington, D.C., how has it changed the dynamics and the relationships in Northeast Asia?
Look, you are a U.S. citizen. Here is the head of one government and the head of a state, which are the closest allies of America in the region. And you ask me, not them.
I will ask them later.
Well, meanwhile, an anti-war protest in South Korea has seen dozens of people injured in clashes with police and many more arrested. Demonstrators were trying to block a convoy of rocket launchers for a controversial U.S. anti-missile system known as THAAD. Nearly 400 peace activists turned out for the rally at the U.S. military base in Songju, a small farming village. They were met by 8,000 security officers sent to oversee the convoy's arrival. Despite the clashes, the system's components have now been deployed. So, THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, is designed to destroy ballistic missiles. It targets short to medium-range weapons and is being supplied to South Korea by Washington. Anti-war activist Medea Benjamin recently visited the site in South Korea and told us why the deployment is causing so much anger.
Well, no, and one has to wonder why hundreds and hundreds of people would come out to protest a system that is supposedly going to make them safer. I was in that village just a few weeks ago, and it's a very conservative village, and these protests are being led mostly by the elders of the village who say, we don't want to be in the eye of the storm. We know that President Trump has just said he's going to allow more highly sophisticated weaponry to go to South Korea, taking billions of dollars of people's money there. This is a cycle of militarism that is extremely dangerous and the opposite of what people on the peninsula need and want.
With confusion and fear hanging over the crisis in the Korean peninsula, President Trump is holding his cards close to his chest when it comes to Washington's next move.
Mr. President, are you considering military action in North Korea? We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Certainly that's not a first choice, but we will see what happens.
However, as Jacqueline Vuga reports, the US could make billions of dollars selling arms to South Korea, Japan, and other parts of the region.
The North Korean threat is something we hear on a daily basis from U.S. officials, with the statements growing grimmer and grimmer.
And his nuclear threats show that he is begging for war.
They will be met with fire and fury.
The stakes could not be higher. The urgency is now.
This man will not get away with what he's doing, believe me.
And the urgency is so strong, the U.S. is rolling out a range of American-made weapons to save the day. On offer, 4 remaining rocket launchers for the U.S. THAAD missile defense system for South Korea. Also, increased amounts of highly sophisticated military equipment, which Trump is kindly allowing both South Korea and Japan to purchase. And the infamously troubled F-35 fighter jets could also be added to that package. A kind of bonus, but not free, of course. But let's not forget that North Korea is by no means the only threat to global security in America's eyes.
For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror, threatening the region and causing so much violence. All nations of conscience must work together to isolate Iran.
And all of those attacks are music to the ears of Saudi Arabia, an American ally and fellow detractor of Iran. So, of course, Riyadh was all too ready to sign a $110 billion defense deal with Trump. Neighboring Qatar also agreed to buy over $21 billion worth of American military hardware. Now, Trump's approach to conflict is definitely pragmatic. Make a quick buck if you can, right? And clearly this guy can sell anything. He even managed to find a way to spin continuing America's 16-year-long war in Afghanistan.
As the Prime Minister of Afghanistan has promised, we are going to participate in economic development to help defray the cost of this war to us.
Hey, if you can't solve the problem, see if you can at least turn a healthy profit instead.
I'm a businessman. That's what I'm supposed to do. That's what I'm supposed to do.
I
I think a lot of people project on the behavior of the United States and maybe of other countries that's all about business, it's all about making money for the arms manufacturers and the plane manufacturers and so forth, the people who make missiles. The militarization of the policy of using military threats and military force as the only item in our toolkit has somehow become so ingrained in their mentality, they really don't consider other alternatives. You have people who believe that the United States is and must be the global hegemon, that every solution must be solved by a diktat from Washington, and whatever force and threats are necessary to achieve that end will be employed.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel's been facing a tough week, both in and out of Parliament. As she continues on her campaign trail before this month's election, she was given a hostile reception in parts of the country. Merkel was jeered and booed by demonstrators during a rally in Finsterwalde yesterday, while on Tuesday a protester threw tomatoes at her during an event. Our Europe correspondent Peter Oliver reports.
It's fair to say that this election campaign hasn't been the most exciting ever, but one point that has, seen some fireworks at least has been when Angela Merkel has showed up in towns where people are strongly against her refugee policy. That was the German Chancellor speaking in Brandenburg on Wednesday evening. Now, she did say that she was specifically going to go to these towns, to these areas there, where political parties like the Alternative for Germany had a foothold, or at least had some kind of strong base, where people had been voicing their concern over her refugee policy. These were the places that she was going to show up. One thing that we didn't have on Wednesday evening in Brandenburg that we saw on Tuesday evening in Heidelberg was flying fruit. We can see the Chancellor here taking the stage in Heidelberg, thankfully wearing that red blazer, because what happens next is, she's hit by one of two tomatoes that were thrown from the crowd, clipped her on the hip there. The other tomato, though, that splattered one of the moderators, Angela Merkel handing her a handkerchief to clean herself up. And also it's worth noting that during this rally, the German Chancellor was asked a question, what are your biggest strengths? And she said that she was calm under fire, or calm under pressure, without making any reference to the tomato throwing. But we had high hopes that this was going to be a close-fought, impassioned electoral campaign with Martin Schulz, the former European Parliament president, pushing Angela Merkel all the way. That really hasn't happened, and at the moment, the German Chancellor looks like she'll be returned almost 15%, 15 points ahead at the moment, with that vote coming up on September the 24th.
However, the tomato incident wasn't the only awkward moment for the Chancellor. Just before that, Angela Merkel was interrupted by the main opposition party while addressing Parliament for taking credit for their work. Eventually, Chancellor Merkel had to remind them who's in charge.